Hello everyone, and welcome to this recording covering deploying a Windows VM using vRealize automation and configuring that virtual machine with SaltStack Config. This is part one of a two-part video series that also maps to my blog post. My name's Dean Lewis, and you can find me on Twitter at SaintDLE and also at the blog theeducate.co.uk. In the agenda, so we're going to cover a quick overview of what is vRealize Automation SaltStack Config. We're going to look at deploying the SaltStack configuration component of vRealize automation with vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager. And then we're going to kick off with preparing our Windows template ready for that deployment with SaltStack configuration through VRA. We're going to configure our initial cloud template itself, and then we're going to test deploying a virtual machine with the SaltStack Minion deployed and configured with that. You can follow along with this video with the blog post theeducate.co.uk/VRA-SSC-win-P1. And then of course we'll be continuing this in part 2 of the series, where we'll look into a deeper configuration of actually configuring our virtual machine along the lines of our enterprise type use cases as well. Okay, so before we dive into the technical configuration of everything, maybe we should just take a step back and introduce ourselves to vRealize Automation SaltStack Config itself. So SaltStack Config is one of the components that falls under the vRealize Automation product. However, unlike CodeStream, Cloud Assembly Service Broker, it is actually deployed as a separate appliance, which we're going to see a little bit when we look at the vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager configuration side of that. So it's a little bit akin to Orchestrator, where you deploy that separate appliance as well. And you can actually purchase and license SaltStack Config as a standalone component as well, without having to have the rest of the vRealize automation product in play as well. But today we're going to be looking at using the two products together. So what is SaltStack Config? It's the configuration management and automation component vRealize automation. So giving you that ability to do day 0, day 1, day 2 and beyond configuration of your deployed assets. And we're going to be looking at it in the use case of virtual machines today, but you can actually use that for any endpoints. That could be Internet of Things devices, that could be network switches or other network devices for it as well. The reason why we've VMware brought in SaltStack configuration itself and purchase SaltStack the company and integrate it into the products is because it brings that configuration management element to the product suite, but it's backed by event-driven configuration management automation. It gives you the ability for remote execution and orchestration as well, so it gives you even more power and control into your automation journey, whether that's on-premise, in the cloud, or outside those virtual machines I've already mentioned. It's also backed by the Salt open source project as well. So VMware now become the guardians of the Salt open source project. That's not going away. And you can still fully use and utilize that standalone to everything we're going to talk about today as well. Diving in a little bit more about the Salt project automation engine. So you have the ability through the event bus, which essentially means all the minions send that data back, send the changes back to the master Salt component itself, and that gives you then the ability to do things like drift remediation. So when we get a message that may be a registry key in our Windows service changed, the Salt will check against that event, check to see if there is a particular state that configures that registry key, and then we'll move it back to its original configuration. And actually at scale, this happens really fast because of that event bus driven architecture. In terms of overall benefits then, it means you've got an improved user experience for remediating issues before they impact your users in an environment. It also means that you've got better system stability and security overall as well. So again, think about web servers that may be exposed. Someone comes in or tries to make a change to a configuration to a public facing web server, that can be changed right back, and actually that's one of the demos by the cloud management team at VMware today as well, in terms of showing you the power of Salt itself. From an enterprise standpoint, so how does it go beyond that Salt open source project? Of course, there is a enterprise based interface that we're going to be dealing with today, and it gives you kind of that things like RBAC, centralized API instance. it gives you the ability then to create things like schedules and jobs in place, and then of course it brings in that integration with vRealize automation as well. And then the last piece that I want to focus on with this overview is the vRealize automation component. So that's the ability to do a cloud template YAML integration. You can drag and drop the SaltStack configuration element onto the canvas, and then you can configure that and link it to your deployments as well. So this means you've got a lot of power as part of that deployment out of the box, and it also then means that you can offer these configuration items up as self-service to your end users through the VRA service broker component as well. So that's enough slides, that's enough overview. Let's dive straight into the technical solution. So first, using vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager, we can actually deploy SaltStack configuration, the Photon appliance from VMware that's managed for you. There are some caveats to doing it this way. I've detailed that for you in the blog, but essentially it's around scale numbers, and essentially if you're going to be using this on quite a large scale, it would be better for you to deploy your own SaltStack configuration management elements and then manage them yourself. And also you get a number of kind of Linux options in terms of distribution and so forth that you can use around that. But the VMware documentation takes you through all of those design decisions, all of those methods of installing and managing that particular environment as well. But obviously for today's demo for my lab, it makes it really nice and easy that I'm going to use Lifecycle Manager to deploy that. I've already got it deployed, but I'm going to show you some of those just configuration steps out of the box. So of course I've already got my vRealize automation environment deployed and managed by Lifecycle Suite Manager today. If I then go to click to add a product, as long as I've downloaded the binary, I can do SaltStack Config, I can do a new install, I can select the version. Of course, I want to match it to the same version as vRealize Automation. And then I want to go here ahead with this VRA integrated option inside of the environment. As you can see, the only deployment type supported today through VSLCM is the standard option. So again, if you want that high availability, highly scalable environment outside of the standard deployment limits, then you will need to deploy that separately yourself. But essentially once you've selected this, then you're going through those wizards to accept the EULA licensing certificate, which instructions deploy it to networks, products, through the checks, and then it will deploy all that for you. So what does that look like once it's deployed? So it's going to deploy that virtual machine for you into your vSphere environment. It's then going to bring that up and it's then going to integrate it with vRealize automation. So the first thing you'll see here is that it's going to be available in the integrations tab. The integration itself, especially if you're going to do this manually, is you provide the host name, you provide the running environment to connect to that. You will see here if it's running in AWS or Azure cloud account, or it can be as the running environment rather, or its sensibility on premise itself. You're going to connect through the username, password, validate that. From a vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager configuration, the other area which it configures today is it will create you a custom property group called SaltStack Configuration. And as you can see here, it's a property group with the server details, such as the primary node address and that fingerprint. So we can see here that it's giving me my FQDN and that certificate fingerprint that's being deployed for it as well. And then that will be used with inside of our templates. Okay. So let's take a look at configuring my Windows server as well out of the box for a kind of easy use. So this is kind of, I've installed this Windows server, I've installed things like Google Chrome out of the box as well. I've created a local folder called store just to kind of keep some configurations in that I can reuse for testing with. I've downloaded Cloud Base Init, which is the Cloud Init version for Windows itself, and there's a fantastic VMware blog that takes you through all of this about how to install it and the configuration that you need to make for this to run in a Windows environment. So for example, you need to install some metadata services. These are passed through the OVF service, so when we pass through that username and password from the cloud template itself. And then we also want to set things like the logon behavior as well. Now in the blog post it tells you to use always, which means when the virtual machine boots up, the username the user's password needs to be reset on login. Unfortunately, having that in place will cause our SaltStack installation to fail. So we actually need to set that to no in our environment so that the the user account does not need resetting. So I'm just going to reopen this config here to show you that. So this is my config. It basically follows the exact same as that blog, apart from this line here set to no. And then essentially when we're installing Cloudbase in it, like the blog says, I'm going to set all this. I'm going to set it to run as admin, as a local service account. I've set the username as admin here, which matches what I'm using in my cloud template, which you'll see in a moment. I go to install this, and essentially the last options that are going to come up is about sys prepping and shutting down the virtual machine. Before we do that, we want to copy those config files across, and then we copy them into the C, into the program files. Oh, put the wrong one there. Into the program files location. It's this cloud-based solutions, cloud-based in it, and this conf folder here to overwrite those. Before I do that though, we might want to run any cleanup scripts that we have on the system. So for example, I always like to clear out the event logs on a Windows system so that when we boot it up from scratch as we've deployed automation, we've got rid of all of those older event logs that mean nothing to us anymore. Some of the other areas that you're going to need to configure as well is WinRM, because Salt actually communicates with Windows over the WinRM service. So if I remember correctly, I think is it WinRM get config or get config? No, is it get WinRM config? There we go. Third time lucky. So what we're looking for here is to make sure that WinRM is actually configured in our environment and it's enabled, so we've got ports set. And I take you through this on the blog post as well. We can see that we've got the authorization set in the environment as well. And then further down in this configuration, we should see this main piece here, which is allow remote access true. And basically to configure WinRM, it's really easy. So we could do WinRM quick config -transport :HTTP, and that will configure it for first time use for us as well. If you are going to be using Salt in a public cloud environment, again, I've linked to the documentation in my blog. There are some additional steps that you need in place as well when it's a public cloud environment, and authentication through HTTPS, for example, as well. Cancel out that. So last thing I'm going to do is go to PowerShell and basically we also need to enable SMB because that's how we upload the file into the Windows server as well. So if I get the get SMB, so let's double check what that is. Okay, so it's going to be SMB server configuration, and then if we pipe that to a select, then it'll be enable SMB2 protocol. And essentially what we're expecting here is for this to be set to true, and it uses SMB2 at the minute for the Salt Minion configuration deployment. If that's set to false, you need to configure that as well. And then the last thing, and I've kind of seen varying success with this at the moment. I guess it depends on your security stance, but you may also find that you need to change your user account control to never notify as well for that installation. In my own testing, I found that sometimes it was failing, and essentially I think it was failing because the pop-up window was coming up for UAC. Again, once you've obviously deployed the virtual machine, you could set Salt to configure UAC back in place as well. Just one more thing to point out as well was the firewall rules that need to be in place to allow the access as well. So if we go to the Windows firewall here, then we just go to advanced setting. You can see that I've actually left the firewall rules on here, and obviously typically I know a lot of people kind of will disable them to begin with for testing and then re-enable them later on. But then essentially I've created an SMB rule to allow that SMB access, and then somewhere in here we should probably see a WinRM rule as well. There you go, the remote management HTTP in rules as well. And what's really important is to make sure that they're on those different profiles as well for domain, private, public, because when your virtual machine comes up, it's probably going to hit a private network as part of that location, that network location access in Windows as well. Once you're happy with all of that, essentially go back to your cloud-based init install, click the run sysprep and shut down that virtual machine at the end of that as well. And convert it to a vSphere template in vCenter. Okay, so now let's dive into using this in the real world. So here is my basic Windows Salt template already. It's very, very simple. So essentially I've dragged and dropped from the left-hand navigation the SaltStack configuration element. I've dragged a cloud agnostic machine rather than the vSphere machine, but you can use the vSphere machine as well if you want. I've linked these two together by the drag and drop, which creates that dependency. So now let's kind of talk through that. So first things first, in the SaltStack configuration piece, it's going to create that host link, so it links it to my virtual machine itself. It's going to set that master ID. So my master ID inside of this SaltStack Salt master configuration itself is going to be SaltStack Enterprise installer by itself. And essentially what's going to happen here is when we deploy this virtual machine, because we've got the SaltStack configuration element attached to it, it's going to deploy what's called the Salt Minion into the guest operating system, which then allows us to manage this from a configuration management point of view as well. We also have the ability out of the box then to start running the Salt configuration files itself. So in my template here, I've already configured the Salt environment where my files based, and then I can also do this for my Salt files as well that I want to run. So it's actually going to auto-complete and find these in the Salt system for me to run in my environment. So we can already see some of the ones that I've already created, which we'll talk about in the second part of the video in more detail. But at the same time, if I wanted, I could actually remove that configuration and leave it as null. So if we do like this and like this, then the autocomplete's getting in the way there for me, then it will actually just deploy that Salt Minion into the VM for me and not try to push any configurations for it as well. So both those options are completely valid. We'll just replace them back as well. From a cloud machine point of view, hopefully for all of you listening, this will be quite familiar using VRA in the past. But essentially, I'm just deploying my image, which is a Windows server. I'm deploying my flavor size. I'm inputting the name manually. I've got some constraint tags. What's the most important here is this remote access piece. So Salt will need remote access details to your machine. If it's a Windows server, it needs to be username and password, so it has to be configured here. We're pulling through this data from this template to then pass into SaltStack to configure that minion. If it's a Linux server, then you can use the username, password, or SSH key as well. So now we've looked at my Windows template, now we've kind of understood how all of this is configured as well. Let's look at the actual deployment. If I click on resources, we can see I've already gone ahead and deployed one earlier just to save some time. We can see each of my items that I've deployed, but first and foremost, I want to go to history. So we can see going through the allocation phases, we can also check the log, so we can see that this is being allocated to my virtual machine name that's being created. I can then see the virtual machine deployed, and then we get to SaltStack itself, and we can also see the job ID that has run for these states. And if I scroll up, we can also see the minion deployment as well. It's because I've set a state in place which is stable presence, we're actually going to see that virtual machine become available in the environment. I'm just going to take a copy of that name. If I go back to my topology, I can still interact with my virtual machine as I expect. I can then also click on my SaltStack element and see all the details about the minions that it's configured for, the states that have been applied, any custom properties that will pass through, and if need be, I can also update that SaltStack configuration as well. I can select which Salt environment to deploy from, and I can also select other state files in the environment to send for configuration as a day 2 action into this virtual machine. And obviously through Service Broker as well, from an end user point of view, you can control what options are available for using these day 2 configuration actions through policies in Service Broker. Finally, we're just going to go to my SaltStack environment itself. So I'm just going to give this a quick refresh. I'm going to go to the minions. So I'm just going to search by ID here. So we can see that my virtual machine's been brought in. It's showing as present because we've enabled that presence as part of the state. If I go to activity and I click on the completed tab, we're now actually going to see here we've got the minion deploy that's happened. And I can click into this job for more details, which I'll show you in a second. We can see the key being accepted in the environment, so vRealize is accepting that key for us automatically because it's expecting it. And then we can see the state apply as well, which is that presence being enabled. If I click to deploy into the minion, I can then click the raw information and we can see details about the deployment into the virtual machine itself. And then if I go to that state apply, again, I can look at the high state, which gives us a nice, easier view to see all of the actions that have happened from that state file that's being applied and the different returns and changes, for example. So essentially it sets up something called a beacon on the machine to send that kind of presence back to our SaltStack server. I can also click on raw and see all of this data in JSON as well. So that takes us through the initial part one of getting started with SaltStack configuration, integrated with vRealize and deploying our Windows machine. We now have our base configuration. So if I go back to this and I go back to that cloud template again, we have our base configuration, deploying our SaltStack element, attaching it to our virtual machine and deploying that minion and applying our first state. In part two, we're then going to look at creating salt states to configure our virtual machine along the line of what we may be doing in an enterprise business to configure our Windows server ready for production usage as well, and also ongoing day two management in the future. Thank you very much.